Neighbor. Emily and Sophie rented a small two-bedroom apartment in an old residential complex on the outskirts of the city. The building was worn but cozy, creaking wooden floors, peeling walls, and narrow hallways with dim lighting gave the place a feeling as if time had stopped. They liked it, especially because the neighbors were quiet. No one made noise through the walls, no doors slammed at night. It was as if the entire building was in a state of eternal slumber. But one day something changed. Late one evening, as Emily was returning home from work, she noticed a faint light in the window of the apartment across from theirs. She had always been certain that it was vacant. The windows were always dark, the mailbox was locked, and no one ever came or went. But now a dim yellow light glowed inside, and behind the curtain a shadow moved. She slowed her steps, peering at the window. The silhouette was tall, thin. The figure stood completely still, as if watching the street. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Just then, the shadow jerked suddenly, as if realizing it had been seen, and vanished deeper into the apartment. Emily quickened her pace, hurrying up the stairs to her door. When she stepped inside, Sophie was on the couch, absorbed in a TV show. "Did you know someone lives in the apartment across from us?" Emily asked, setting her bag down. Sophie frowned and paused the show. "In which one?" "Right across from us. I saw someone moving in there." Sophie's frown deepened. No. That place has been empty for like 5 years. I asked the landlord when we moved in. No one lives there." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew what she had seen. Someone had been there. Later that night, she glanced out the window again. The light in the apartment across the way was gone, but the uneasy feeling remained. She couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching her. The silence of the night was broken by a faint creaking sound, as if a door was slowly opening. Emily froze. The creaking stopped, replaced by another sound, a faint, dragging shuffle. It came from outside in the hallway. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she approached the door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Then a dull thud. Once, then again, like someone slowly knocking. Not on her door, on something else. The wall, maybe. She swallowed hard, reached for the lock, and carefully cracked the door open just a few inches. The hallway was empty. The dim overhead lights flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows. At the end of the hall, the door to the apartment across from theirs stood slightly ajar. Beyond it was pure darkness. And then she saw it. In the sliver between the door and the frame, something was watching her. An eye motionless, unblinking, pitch black. Emily let out a strangled gasp and slammed the door shut, her whole body trembling. She locked it, stumbling backward, pressing both hands against her chest as her heart pounded violently. She ran to Sophie's room and shook her awake. What's wrong?" Sophie mumbled sleepily. "There's someone there," Emily whispered. "In the apartment across from us. He was watching me." Sophie propped herself up on her elbow, eyes widening. "Are you sure?" "Yes. I saw him. He was standing there, staring through the door." Sophie took a deep breath and got out of bed. "All right, let's check." But when they opened their door and looked across the hall, the apartment opposite was shut. And not just shut, the keyhole was clogged with dust, and the door was coated in a thin layer of grime, as if it hadn't been opened in years. "Emily, are you sure?" Sophie began, but stopped when she saw Emily's face. Emily wasn't looking at the door. She was staring at the floor. Right in front of their door, dark, wet footprints trailed across the wooden floor. Barefoot prints, leading straight back to the apartment across the hall. Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to every sound in the apartment. The moment kept replaying in her mind. The black eye staring at her through the crack. The dark footprints on the floor. Her hands were still trembling. No matter how much she tried to convince herself it had all been a dream. But the footprints were real. They had remained on the hallway floor even after Sophie turned on the lights and examined them closely. They were fresh. Someone had walked barefoot across the dust-covered wood. Someone who shouldn't have been there. "We'll ask the neighbors in the morning," Sophie said firmly, shutting the door. "Maybe someone broke in. We need to be careful." Emily nodded, but she wasn't sure this was just a person. The next morning, they knocked on the door of old Mr. Johnson, who lived on the first floor and knew everything that happened in the building. "Sorry to bother you, but has anyone moved into the apartment across from ours?" Sophie asked cautiously. The old man frowned. "Which one?" "The one right across from us," Emily said. Johnson slowly shook his head. "Girls, that apartment has been empty for 8 years. The owner died, and she had no family. No one's been inside since." Emily swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" Her voice was hoarse. "Of course," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Why? Did you see someone in there?" Sophie glanced at her friend, but Emily remained silent. "We just heard some noises," she finally muttered. "In old buildings, things always creak," Johnson shrugged. "But if anything strange happens again, don't go in there." As soon as they stepped outside, Sophie turned to Emily. "Why didn't you tell him?" "Because he wouldn't believe us," Emily hissed. "Sophie, I saw him. That eye. And it wasn't human." Sophie exhaled. "Maybe you're just exhausted. Let's wait. If something happens again tonight, we call the police." That night, Emily woke up, not from a sound, from a feeling. Someone was watching her. She slowly opened her eyes and saw that the bedroom door was slightly open. Something stood in the hallway. It didn't move. It just watched. The dim light from the window outlined the faint shape of a tall, thin figure, completely motionless. Emily's heartbeat exploded in her chest. She wanted to wake Sophie, but she couldn't move. The figure took a step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath its weight. Then another step. It was getting closer. Sophie shifted in her sleep, and in that instant, the silhouette vanished into the darkness. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe. When she opened them again, the door to the hallway was closed. But on the floor, right beside her bed, there were new footprints, and they weren't human. Emily didn't sleep a single minute until morning. She didn't tell Sophie what she had seen during the night. Her friend already thought she was paranoid. But the thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. The footprints, they were elongated, wrongly shaped, as if the toes were too long, and the foot itself, unnaturally narrow. When Sophie woke up, Emily was already sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly into her cup of cold coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" Sophie yawned, stretching. Emily shook her head. I heard him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was in the hallway." Sophie frowned. "Are you sure you're not overthinking this? I saw the footprints. Go look for yourself." Sophie sighed and walked into the bedroom. A minute later, she returned, her face pale. "There's nothing there, Em." Emily shot up from her chair. Number that wasn't possible. The prints had been there. She had seen them. She rushed into the room and froze in the doorway. The floor was clean. No prints, no marks, just smooth, untouched wooden planks. "But her breath hitched. "They were here. I'm not crazy." Sophie exhaled heavily and wrapped an arm around her. "Listen, you just need some rest. You're imagining things. Even Mr. Johnson said no one lives there." Emily wanted to believe her. She had to believe her, but something inside her whispered otherwise. That evening, Sophie suggested they go for a walk, take their minds off things. They spent a few hours out, deliberately avoiding the subject of the past few nights. When they returned, the building was quiet. Sophie had just pulled out her keys when Emily stopped in her tracks. The door to the apartment across the hall was open. Not just slightly ajar, it was wide open. Inside, only darkness waited. Emily's palms grew clammy with sweat. "Sophie," she whispered. Her friend looked at her, then followed her gaze. She paled instantly. "Shit," Sophie breathed. "We need to leave." But before they could move, a sound came from inside the apartment. At first it was soft, barely audible, a faint, shuffling rustle. Then, a thud. Deep, heavy, as if something had slammed against the wall. Another thud. And then, footsteps. Slow, uneven, too close. Sophie fumbled with the keys, yanking open their door. They barely made it inside before something slammed against it from the outside. The door shook violently, as if struck by something massive. Both of them screamed and pressed themselves against the wall. Silence. Emily didn't dare breathe. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her fingers numb from tension. Minutes passed. Nothing. Sophie hesitated, then carefully approached the peephole. She pressed her eye to the tiny glass window and gasped, immediately stumbling backward, hands flying to her mouth. Emily rushed to her. "What? What is it?" Sophie let out a shaky breath, eyes wide with terror. "There's someone standing there." Emily froze. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she leaned in and looked through the peephole. Something stood outside their door. Tall, unnaturally thin. But that wasn't the worst part. It wasn't moving. It was leaning forward so close to the door that its face nearly pressed against it, and its eye was staring directly into the peephole. Emily jerked away from the peephole, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Sophie stood beside her, hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she whispered, barely breathing. Emily's mind raced frantically. Run? But where? Call the police? And tell them what? That something was standing outside their door that shouldn't exist? Another sound came from the hallway, a slow, dragging shuffle, as if something was slithering across the floor. Then, scratching, long, sharp nails or something worse, scraping against their door. Shit! 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 Sophie curled up into a ball, sliding down the wall. Emily gripped her friend's hand tightly, unable to tear her gaze away from the door. They sat like that for what felt like an eternity, holding their breath until silence. And then, click. The lock turned from the inside. Emily screamed and lunged at the door, yanking the handle back, trying to force it shut. But something was pushing from the other side. "Help me!" she screamed. Sophie sprang up and grabbed the door, both of them pressing their full weight against it. The pressure on the other side continued, and then it stopped. Silence. They froze, afraid to even breathe. Snap! The door slowly swung shut, on its own. A chill ran down Emily's spine. She bolted for the lock, twisted it shut, snapped the chain into place, and stumbled backward, gasping for air. It tried to come in," she whispered. Sophie just nodded, hugging herself tightly. Neither of them dared to move. They listened. Nothing. "We need to leave," Sophie finally choked out. Emily looked at her. Sophie was deathly pale. "You want to just leave?" Emily whispered. "And leave it here?" Sophie grabbed her hand, hard. "If we stay, it will get in, Emily." Emily swallowed hard. They both knew. This wasn't going away. Sophie started frantically packing a bag, but Emily couldn't move. Her gaze drifted back to the peephole. It was blocked. Something on the other side was covering it. And then, a sound, software gentle, almost affectionate, tapping, from inside the apartment, behind them. Sophie screamed first. Emily spun around, her eyes darting to the far corner of the room. Something was standing there. Tall, too tall, dark and stretched, its form unnatural. It didn't move, but they knew. It was watching them. Emily's legs felt weak beneath her. The air in the room had thickened, pressing down on them, filled with something foreign. The shadows around them deepened, swallowing the dim glow of the lamp. The thing slowly tilted its head. It was studying them. And then it smiled. Its lips stretched too wide. Its jaw unhinged, revealing a row of too long teeth, crammed together as if they didn't quite fit inside its mouth. Sophie stumbled backward, her breath coming in sharp, broken gasps. She lunged for the door, but her hands were shaking, refusing to obey. The lock wouldn't turn. Emily felt cold terror rip through her spine. The thing stepped forward. Its movements were wrong, jerky, as if it wasn't used to its own body. Another step. The floorboards didn't make a sound. Its fingers, long, too long, stretched toward them, reaching through the air between them. The skin was thin, dry, stretched too tight, like old parchment. "It can't be here. "It shouldn't be here," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. The thing twitched. Sophie screamed. In a final desperate attempt, she yanked the door with all her strength, and this time, the lock gave way. The door swung open. Light from the hallway flooded the room. They bolted outside. But before Emily could slam the door shut, it lunged. For a split second, she saw its hands, reaching for her, almost touching her. The fingers slammed against the doorframe, metal scraping against wood with a horrible clatter. Bang! The door shut. Silence. They ran. That very night, they packed whatever they could carry, left their belongings behind, abandoned their deposit, and never looked back. The apartment remained empty, but not for long. 2 weeks later, the landlord rented it out to new tenants, a young couple. On move-in day, their laughter echoed down the stairwell as they carried in their belongings. That night, one of them woke up to tapping at the door. Software gentle, almost patient, as if someone was waiting. But this time, the door began to open on its own.
If this story made your heart race, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button to support new chilling tales and tap the bell. That way, you won't miss the next dose of horror. In the comments, let us know how much you enjoyed the story and which themes scare you the most. Who knows? Maybe your idea will become the next nightmare.